Hello and welcome to this presentation on acid attacks, accessible, appealing, and hard to counter. My name is Philipp Bleek.
And I'm Cyrus Jabbari.
So here we've got a pretty standard disclaimer. The views that we're about to express to you are our own and do not reflect the official policies or positions of any of our current or past employers or funders. So I want to start by setting the scene. I want you to imagine that we're in Washington, D.C. in the evening, and a foreign diplomat is being escorted from her vehicle across a campus to a speaking engagement by her diplomatic security detail. And as she's passing a group of protesters, a young man with a soda cup splashes her in the face. And I want to freeze right here and ask a couple questions. First, is there anything that her security detail might have done to avoid this? Second, what is the range of potential consequences, both for her personally and also more broadly for others, depending on what she was just splashed with? And finally, what might we hope that her security detail was ready to do in the seconds and the minutes after this possible attack? We'll circle back to this scenario at the end of the presentation, and we'll also unpack some broader content that's relevant to this over the course of the presentation. So hold that thought if you had any reactions to this. So bottom line up front, substances that are suitable for so-called acid attacks, and I say so-called because we're talking about both acidic and basic corrosive chemicals, are widely available, and many of them are not suitable or at least challenging to control. While acid attacks thankfully won't appeal to a lot of terrorists, including those who are interested in more indiscriminate effects, and in particular, those who are interested in more lethal effects, they will appeal to others, and they have historically appealed to others, both because of their direct impact on those targeted and because of their psychological impacts on others who witness the damage that they cause. Authorities have a toolkit to respond to acid attacks. They can try to deter them. They can impede access to some relevant chemicals. They can reduce attack opportunities in some contexts, and they can prepare to respond more effectively post-attack, in particular through decontamination measures. But even if they pursue this full toolkit, significant vulnerabilities still remain. So quick agenda, here's what we'll do in the rest of this talk. Briefly, we want to introduce ourselves and what we bring to the table here, talk about what acid attacks are, talk about how they have occurred in the past through the present, what might change in future, talk about how authorities have responded to the challenge of acid attacks, broadly talk about policy responses, give you some bottom lines to sum up at the end, and then after this, we'll be happy to engage with questions and answers. So I am Philipp Bleek. I'm a chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons policy generalist. I work at the intersection of academia, think tanks, and government. I'm currently a professor in the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies program at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, located in Monterey, California. I have experience in both the think tank and government context in the past. In particular, I served as senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs, where I worked on a variety of things. Among them, I staffed a Defense Department-based but interagency group called the Syrian Chemical Weapons Senior Integration Group that prepared for ways in which chemical weapons might and then did come into play in the Syrian conflict. I'm the author of various publications related to cyber and terrorism, a number of them with my colleague at this talk, Cyrus Jabbari. And I just wanted to slightly caveat my background. I'm a political scientist. I have a PhD in political scientist. I have a limited science and technical background, but I work on a lot of issues at the intersection of science, technology, and policy.
And I'm Cyrus Jabbari. I'm a early career cyber and policy generalist with a focus also on Middle East security. I'm a recent master's graduate from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey in the Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies program, where I met my mentor and friend, Dr. Blake. I'm currently fulfilling a graduate fellowship in the US government, and I have some government and think tank background. And I also have authored various publications related to cyber and terrorism, most with Dr. Blake. And I too have a limited science and technical background, though many of the topics that I've worked on are at the intersection of science and technology and policy.
Great. So what are acid attacks? Acid attacks involve throwing caustic chemicals onto the face and or the body of a victim who's being targeted. Uh, and both liquid, acidic, and basic chemicals that are corrosive are particularly suitable to such attacks, though notionally one could imagine solids, perhaps gels, other forms of chemicals being used as well. Uh, Acid attacks terrorize those targeted, and genuine acid attacks and also fake acid attacks may terrorize, and then genuine acid attacks harm and rarely, though sometimes, kill those who are attacked. Horrific disfigurement of survivors also terrorizes a broader population, which sees those individuals after they survive those attacks. The tactic is appealing both because it sends a message to those who are targeted, but also to a broader audience, and also because it's extremely accessible. We just want to note that acid attacks are a subset of a broader universe of crude or improvised chemical attacks, but in this talk, we'll be focusing on that subset of so-called acid attacks. So how have they occurred? So acid attacks have a long history in the context of personal, criminal, and political activity. Uh, the tactic appears to be spreading to places where it was previously rare, including the United Kingdom. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, which has faced an epidemic of both personally and criminally motivated attacks in recent years. To date, there have been only limited cases of acid attacks to conduct terrorism or in the pursuit of political aims among terrorists. Eco-radicals, left and right-wing extremists, and militant Islamists have all used the tactic.
So there are many cases of use or threatened use of acid against objects for disruptive purposes by eco-radicals, and there are some instances of use by them for terrorist purposes against individuals. One of the earliest cases took place in the early 2000s when a group called Stop Huntington Life Sciences sprayed a group, or the marketing director, Andrew Gray, of a group called Huntington Life Sciences, in the face with an unidentified chemical spray, leaving him temporarily blinded and writhing on the ground. In 2007, anti-whaling environmentalists ended up attacking a Japanese whaling vessel by throwing butyric acid onto the sailors of that whaling vessel. And in one of the more recent instances of eco-radical acid terrorism, a pair of eco-radicals caused bodily harm by throwing acid onto an executive of a coal mining company subsidiary in Germany in 2018. But there's a much longer history of acid use or acid violence and acid terrorism among left and right wing extremists. One of the earliest cases that we could identify was in 1922 when a right wing paramilitary group had attempted to assassinate a German minister, Philipp Scheidemann, by throwing acid onto him. And in 1981, individuals who identified themselves as members of the May 19th Communists had gone to an anti-apartheid rally near JFK Airport in New York and thrown acid into a crowd attempting to attack police. In the 1990s, anti-abortionists began taking acid as a form of violence, particularly by threatening individuals who were frequenting abortion clinics or going to abortion clinics, I should say, by throwing acid at the doorways or at the windows of the abortion clinics, trying to prevent them from going in. But eventually, they started using acid by throwing the substances directly onto individuals who were going inside and outside of abortion clinics. And in 2012, there was a lot of online chatter of anarchists threatening to attack the Republican National Convention. But one of the most alarming and recent instances of right-wing use of acid for violence was when an anti-migrant right-wing group in Germany had used acid in a hybrid attack along with explosives on a housing project. There's also an interesting trend of anti-liberalist radicals in Eastern Europe, particularly in Russia and in Ukraine, using a mixture of a common household cleaning fluid called Zelonka with an unknown chemical substance to attack individuals who are part of basically liberalist or opposition or anti-corruption groups or organizations. But this trend didn't take place until recent years. Until 2017, one of the earliest cases of acid violence that we could identify in Eastern Europe was in 1998, when reports emerged of acid attacks taking place against reporters in Bulgaria. But beginning in 2017, Alexei Navalny, a well-known opposition member, was apparently attacked with a mixture of Zelenka and an unknown chemical in Russia. And following that, members of Yabloko activists, opposition activists, and other anti-corruption activists in Russia and later in Ukraine began being attacked with this Zelenka mixture. But the case of militant Islamists is interesting insofar as acid attacks have not been used widely as a tactic among militant Islamists in Western countries. Attacks, though, have occurred frequently, and I'd say to a large extent, in countries like Iraq, Iran, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Tanzania, and Nigeria, by individuals who are affiliated with groups including Al Qaeda, the Taliban, and the so called Islamic State. Most of these attacks are conducted against women for immodesty or for violating religious code. And acid attacks have also been used against those who they perceive as enemies of Islam, notably in Israel and in the United Kingdom. And now I'll turn it to Dr. Blake.
So what might change in terms of the acid terrorism threat in particular in future? Given their evident accessibility and appeal to certain actors, acid attacks appear to be plausible candidates to go viral, as other terrorism tactics have, in particular, suicide terrorism. Acid attacks are generally weapons of the weak. They're carried out by actors who have very limited capabilities to conduct other forms of violence. And that describes many of those who are radicalized by, but have few direct connections to established terrorist groups. For example, there are many individuals in recent years who've been radicalized by the online propaganda of the so-called Islamic State, but who have no direct connections to the Islamic State and very limited abilities themselves to plan and carry out attacks. And acid attacks, we fear, are both accessible to such individuals and may be appealing to them. In addition, personally or criminally motivated attacks, which, as we noted, are growing in prevalence in some countries like the UK and some others, might help inspire terrorist attacks. So how have authorities responded to this threat? Many of the responses that they've undertaken apply to all forms of acid attack, personally, criminally, or politically motivated attacks. The primary responses fall into three basic categories: denial, trying to prevent people from being able to carry out an attack; deterrence, punishing attacks to try to deter other people from carrying out attacks; and response, in particular, decontamination, trying to respond effectively, and in particular, decontaminating people targeted with acid. These policies have met with varying degrees of success, but particular countries' responses shed interesting light on both the opportunities and the challenges of responding more effectively. And Cyrus will talk about a couple of the specific countries that we delved into.
Thanks. So many of you are probably aware of the trend that emerged in the mid 2010s of acid attacks being used for personally motivated crimes or other criminal uses. And there was a sharp rise, particularly in 2015 to 2016, that led the UK Home Office to develop a series of responses to address the threat. One was by developing, promulgating, and harmonizing punitive measures for acid attackers and possessors, like making possession of acid in a public space the equivalent of a crime of carrying a knife in a public space, having no good intent. They eventually devised new ways to regulate the sale of caustic chemicals and deny would-be attackers the ability to obtain them by improving licensing requirements and reach out to industry to make sure that there's buy-in among the retailers of caustic substances to at least attempt to regulate and prevent attackers from gaining access to these substances. And attacks decreased by about 40% in the first half of 2018 versus the same period in 2017. And these are the most recent figures we have. Although online press reports suggest that, and are very much to believe, that acid violence continues in the United Kingdom, Whether it's trending up or down is unknown. So in Pakistan and in India, those two countries have long been plagued by acid violence, at least longer than the United Kingdom. And the responses in Pakistan and in India had very much informed responses in the United Kingdom. Pakistan is an interesting story insofar as in 2010, it made acid attacks illegal and possibly incurring life sentences, modeling after Bangladesh's response to acid attacks. But this was largely viewed as ineffective as the attacks increased for 7 years. And this was mainly because trials were slow or stalled, and attackers were able to gain bail rather easily. So in 2017, Pakistan established more effective provisions to criminalize attacks and ensure speedy trials. And as they further improved the trial process, there was a 50% year-to-year decline since 2014. It's still worth mentioning that acid is quite accessible. Attacks persist in in Pakistan, and acid transactions are still ongoing and not very well regulated. India seems to have a similar, but we rate rather less effective experience. Like Pakistan, it had a significant hurdle um, because of the slow speed of trials and backlog in its judicial system. It enacted punitive measures for acid violence and regulations for acid transactions in 2013, but because the system was very decentralized, this had very little effect. It delegated authority to the district magistrates to enforce, either by regulating chemicals or speeding up trials. Acid attacks increased until a slight decline in 2018, but the backlog in trials and verdicts persists, and chemicals listed in their regulations are still rather accessible.
So what can governmental authorities do about this challenge? Um, they have, as the case studies that Cyrus shared, some limited options to try to prevent attacks. They have a lot of opportunity for punishment and via punishment deterrence. And then there's some potential to improve existing options for response and in particular decontamination. And Cyrus will unpack each of these in turn.
So, a common theme for prevention and punishment and decontamination of individuals or victims is there needs to be improved work with government, industry, academia, and NGOs that focus on caustic chemical violence and sharing lessons learned. Developing working groups is one effective way to get all those different communities together. Government also needs to review the regulations on caustic chemical transactions, as there seems to be disparity either at a national level or within a regional level on licensing requirements and listing of the exact chemicals that are high risk for acid attacks, so-called acid attacks. There also needs to be an establishment of protocol for commercial reporting of caustic chemical transactions after such review, by establishing an online portal for retailers to interface with government or other groups, for registering sales, and for mandating and ensuring a catalog of photo ID for any acid transactions that may exist. On the punishment side, again, it's important to review whatever extant legislation there is on assault and or caustic chemical violence and consider promulgating punishments specific to acid attacks. The UK and India and Pakistan all juggled with the idea of isolating acid violence as one type of violence that receives a specific punishment because of the long-lasting effects that are incurred by victims from their horrific disfigurement, etc. This is something worth noting and considering. And with that, it's important to synchronize and harmonize the legal authorities, academia, and NGOs that are responsible or looking at this issue to identify and attribute acid violence and ensure speedy trials. On the decontamination side, it remains a formidable challenge for any country facing acid attacks because of the quick timeline that the right of douse stage rather than right of boom stage offers for reducing the seriousness of injury. And it is intensive in both resource allocation and awareness raising to ensure effective response. Hypertonic amphoteric chelating solutions are more effective than water in removing acid and neutralizing effects, but they are also more costly, and prepositioning them entails logistical challenges versus grabbing just a bucket of water nearby or a bottle of water. Compared to decontaminating victims as well, scene decontamination poses far lesser challenges. So, on the decontamination side, it's important to improve work between government, the commercial sector, and NGOs in distributing acid attack response kits, like burn kits essentially, or chelating solutions. It's also important to increase awareness raising of acid violence with commercial and entertainment sectors, law enforcement, and governments, especially at a time like right now when we're facing restrictions on a lot of entertainment and commercial interfacing with the public. It's an opportunity to, as Dr. Blake and I like to say, get ahead of, or at least less behind, this growing trend in many places. And with that, it's important to ensure the stockpiling of chelating solutions, the most effective way of at least reducing the effects of douse for VIP protection. And Dr. Blake will talk more about VIP protection considerations.
So I want to circle back to this scenario that we started with. Uh, Acid attacks are particularly challenging for those who are trying to provide protection for VIPs. VIPs of various kinds. So those might be government officials, they might be celebrities, they might be business leaders. There are many individuals who might have some degree of security protection. And VIPs are sporadically assaulted with substances that could be, but usually are not, caustic. But because of the really short timelines associated with the damage that caustic substances cause, those substances, when VIPs are assaulted with substances, they really need to be treated as though they're caustic in the immediate aftermath of an attack or an exposure. One really simple way to try to reduce this risk is just to keep VIPs more distanced from crowds. And just keeping your protectee 10 feet or more from a crowd provides considerable protection, because overwhelmingly what we're talking about is thrown substances. Now, notionally, someone might be able to convey a substance over a greater distance, say with a super soaker advanced water pistol or some other device, but overwhelmingly we're talking about things that are thrown from cups or water bottles. And so just a little bit of separation goes a long way. The problem is that that's in tension with activities like handshaking, like autographing, like allowing people to take selfies with the VIP. And those are specifically activities that VIPs, like politicians, like celebrities, are often really eager to be able to do. An effective post-attack protocol, if someone is in fact exposed, requires the security detail to engage in planning, in training, and in some degree of stockpiling, depending on what their response plan is. And it has to focus on a couple activities. One is just rinsing whatever substance has just been thrown onto the person being protected. One kind of additional challenge here is, if someone is exposed to something, that substance, assuming it's a liquid, will drip down onto their clothing and continue to expose their underlying skin. And so disrobing really needs to be part of an effective response. And this creates a real challenge for maintaining the privacy and dignity of the person being protected, whether that's a political figure or a celebrity or some other kind of individual. And there's a tension between rapidly disrobing, which may be really important if someone was actually exposed to a really caustic substance, and preserving the privacy and dignity of the person being protected. And then finally, rapid medical attention may be warranted if it turns out that the substance was in fact caustic. And just thinking about how that decision gets made, right? Do you wait until the VIP is in pain and that's how you know it's a caustic substance? Do you treat every substance to which they're exposed as potentially caustic? So that's an additional complication, is thinking about both the decision to seek medical attention and obviously the process for rapidly getting that person to the medical attention they may require. So bottom lines, and these are just a recap of our bottom lines up front. Substances that are suitable for so-called acid attacks are widely available, and although there's some things that can be done and have been done in some countries to try to make them less accessible, there are a lot of substances that are still going to be quite accessible. Thankfully, acid attacks aren't going to appeal to a lot of terrorists, but unfortunately they are going to appeal to some. And we argue that actually they have the potential to appeal to even more than they have in the past. So we are, I would say, guardedly pessimistic about the incremental spread, or maybe less than, maybe more rapid spread of this tactic in future, though certainly we hope that we're wrong. Authorities have, as we've talked about, a toolkit to respond. They can try to deter attacks. They can impede access to at least some relevant chemicals. They can reduce attack opportunities in some contexts, in particular a VIP protection kind of context. And they can prepare to try to respond more effectively post-attack. Even if they embrace that full portfolio of response options, we think this remains a really thorny policy challenge. And then for those who might be interested, if you're interested in additional information, this presentation is based on an article that Cyrus and I published a couple months ago in CBRNE World, and you can find a link to that on my faculty page. I've got the link for you here. If you're interested in CBRN more broadly, beyond acid and acid terrorism, Cyrus and I have co-published on a couple other wholly unrelated but CBRN related topics, and I've got both the publications and links for you here. And then finally, on my faculty webpage, I have some publications on yet more CBRN related topics if you're interested. And with that, we just wanted to say thank you for joining us for this presentation, and we are looking forward to the Q&A that will follow this.